You know, there's something rather peculiar that happens to certain people. They walk into a room and they feel it all. The unspoken tension between two friends, the hidden sadness behind a smile. And we've been told this is a gift, haven't we? This ability to see what others miss. But I want to suggest something quite different to you today. That this very ability, this clear seeing, might be the most dangerous thing you'll ever possess. Now, I'm not speaking of danger in the ordinary sense. I'm not talking about physical harm. I'm speaking of something far more subtle and far more devastating. The danger of becoming so aware that you can no longer participate in the beautiful unconsciousness that allows most people to live their lives in relative peace. Have you ever watched people at a party? Really watched them? They're playing a game, you see. Everyone knows the rules without ever being told. You ask how someone is, they say fine. And you both pretend this is a complete answer. You compliment the host, you laugh at jokes that aren't particularly funny. You nod sympathetically at stories you've heard before. It's a kind of collective agreement to stay on the surface, to keep things pleasant, to not look too deeply. But then there's you, the one who sees through it all. You notice the wife who flinches slightly when her husband speaks. You sense the colleague who's desperately lonely, despite being surrounded by friends. You feel the anxiety rippling through the room like an invisible current. And here's where the danger begins. Because once you see these things, you cannot unsee them. And more troubling still, your very presence becomes a kind of mirror that others cannot bear to look into. Let me tell you what I mean. When you see clearly, when you perceive the hidden currents beneath social interaction, you're essentially calling attention to what everyone has agreed to ignore. And people don't like this. They really don't like this. Not because they're bad or stupid, but because your clarity threatens the very structure that allows them to function. Think of it this way. Society is rather like a stage play. Everyone has their part. The successful businessman, the devoted mother, the reliable friend. These are roles, you understand. Costumes we put on. And the play works beautifully, so long as everyone stays in character. But you, with your penetrating awareness, you're like an audience member who stands up in the middle of the performance and shouts, "But that's just an actor pretending." Well, you can imagine how welcome that makes you. The first danger, then, is isolation. And I don't mean the ordinary loneliness of not having enough friends. I mean something far more profound. The isolation of living in a completely different reality from everyone around you. You're speaking a language nobody else understands. You're seeing a world nobody else can see. And the terrible irony is that the more clearly you perceive, the more alone you become. I once knew a woman, let's call her Sarah, who had this extraordinary ability to read people. She could walk into a room and immediately sense who was genuine and who was performing, who was in pain and who was pretending to be fine, who could be trusted and who was hiding something. And you know what happened to her? She lost every close relationship she had. Not because she was cruel or judgmental, but simply because people felt exposed around her. They couldn't maintain their comfortable masks in her presence. Her friends would say things like, "You're too intense. You read too much into everything and you cry. Can't you just relax and have fun?" But she couldn't. Because seeing clearly isn't something you can turn on and off like a light switch. It's like asking someone who can hear to simply ignore sound. Once you've developed this capacity for perception, it's always there, always operating, always showing you what others prefer to keep hidden. And here's the second danger. When you see the truth of a situation, when you perceive what's really happening beneath the surface, you face a terrible choice. Do you speak or stay silent? If you speak, you risk being attacked. And I mean this quite literally, though the attack is usually psychological rather than physical. You'll be called negative, overly sensitive, a troublemaker. You'll be accused of creating problems that don't exist, of reading malice into innocent situations, of being unable to just let things be. But if you stay silent, if you swallow what you see and pretend not to notice, you begin to lose contact with yourself. Because every time you ignore your own perception, every time you accept someone else's version of reality when you know it's false, you're essentially telling yourself that your experience cannot be trusted. And over time, this creates a kind of split in your being. Part of you knows the truth, but another part must pretend not to know it. This is madness of a very quiet sort. I remember years ago sitting in a meeting where everyone was congratulating themselves on how well a particular project was going. And I could see clear as day that the whole thing was about to collapse. The signs were everywhere. The forced enthusiasm, the avoidance of certain topics, the way people's eyes would slide away when difficult questions arose. But when I gently suggested that perhaps we should examine some concerning patterns, I was met with hostility. Not argument, mind you. Not reasoned disagreement. Pure defensive hostility. And this brings us to the third danger, the most insidious one. When you see clearly and others don't want to see, they will often turn their anger on you. Not consciously, perhaps. They won't sit down and decide to make you the villain. But unconsciously, automatically, they will begin to treat you as the problem. As if your perception is creating the very difficulties you're merely observing. This is what I call the phenomenon of shooting the messenger. When someone points out that the emperor has no clothes, the crowd doesn't thank them for the truth. The crowd turns on them for disturbing the comfortable fiction everyone was enjoying. Your clarity becomes a threat, and threats must be eliminated or controlled. I've watched this pattern repeat itself countless times. The person who sees clearly gets labeled. They're too negative. They're creating drama. They're unstable. They need to lighten up. They're paranoid. Notice how all these labels have one thing in common. They all suggest that the problem lies in the perceiver, not in what's being perceived. It's a brilliant defensive maneuver, really. If we can convince you that your perception is flawed, we never have to look at what you're perceiving. But here's what nobody tells you. The fourth danger is perhaps the most devastating of all. When you're constantly absorbing the emotional states and hidden truths of everyone around you, when you're perpetually picking up on what's unspoken and unfelt, you begin to lose track of what actually belongs to you. Your own feelings become mixed up with everyone else's. You walk into a room feeling perfectly fine and leave feeling inexplicably anxious or sad or angry. And you have no idea if these feelings are yours or if you've simply absorbed them from the environment like a sponge soaking up water. This is exhausting beyond measure. Imagine never quite knowing which thoughts are your own, never being certain whether the emotion you're feeling belongs to you or to the person sitting next to you. It's like trying to hear your own voice in a room full of people all talking at once. Eventually, you might forget what your voice even sounds like. I've spoken with people who describe this experience, and they often say the same thing. I feel like I'm disappearing, like there's less and less of me and more of everyone else. And this isn't poetry. This is a real psychological danger. When the boundaries between self and other become too permeable, when you're taking in too much without adequate protection, you can actually lose contact with your own center, your own identity. Now you might be thinking, well, this all sounds rather grim. Is there no hope for those who see clearly? And here's where we come to something interesting. Because the danger I'm describing is only dangerous when it's unconscious, when you don't understand what's happening to you, when you think you're going mad or that something is wrong with you. But once you understand the game, once you see that your clarity is not a flaw but a particular kind of awareness, everything changes. Not because the seeing stops, but because your relationship to it transforms. you begin to realize that you're not required to save everyone from their unconsciousness. You're not obligated to point out every hidden truth or fix every unacknowledged problem. You see, the truly dangerous thing isn't the seeing itself. It's the compulsion to do something about what you see. The belief that if you perceive a problem, you must solve it. If you sense someone's pain, you must heal it. If you notice a group's dysfunction, you must correct it. This is where the real trouble begins, because you're essentially taking responsibility for things that aren't yours to fix. Let me give you an image. Imagine you're walking by a river, and you notice the water is muddy. You can see this clearly. Everyone else passing by seems not to notice or not to care. Now you have a choice. You can jump into the river and try to clear it with your hands, stirring it up more in your efforts, exhausting yourself in an impossible task. Or you can simply observe that the water is muddy, perhaps make a note that it might be wise to wait before drinking from it, and continue on your way. The water will clear itself when the conditions are right. Your frantic stirring won't help. In fact, it will make things worse. This is the wisdom that must accompany clear seeing. The understanding that not everything you perceive requires your intervention. But here's the paradox. Once you stop trying to fix everything you see, once you relax into simply being aware without the compulsion to change or control, your perception often becomes even clearer. And more than that, people begin to feel safer around you. Because you're no longer unconsciously demanding that they see what you see or change to accommodate your awareness. Think of it like this. When you meet someone who sees you clearly, but doesn't need you to be different, who perceives your struggles without trying to rescue you, who understands your fears without requiring you to face them on their schedule, how does that feel? It feels like freedom, doesn't it? Like you can finally breathe. This is what clear seeing can become when it's integrated properly. Not a weapon you use against others' unconsciousness, but a gift you offer through your presence. You see them completely, and in that seeing, you allow them to be exactly as they are. This doesn't mean you approve of everything or pretend problems don't exist. It means you've stopped making their unconsciousness your personal project. I want to be very clear about something. I'm not suggesting you become cold or indifferent. I'm not proposing that you stop caring about people or turn away from genuine suffering. What I'm suggesting is that there's a difference between compassionate awareness and compulsive fixing, between seeing clearly and making yourself responsible for what you see. The danger of seeing what others don't lies not in the perception itself, but in what you do with it. If you use it to separate yourself, to feel superior, to justify your isolation, then yes, it becomes dangerous. If you use it to attack others for their blindness, to shame them for not seeing, to punish them for their unconsciousness, then yes, it destroys relationships and leaves you alone. But if you can hold your clarity lightly, if you can see without grasping, perceive without controlling, understand without demanding, then your awareness becomes something entirely different. It becomes a space in which others can gradually wake up at their own pace, in their own time, without being forced or pushed or judged. Here's what I've learned after many years of watching people with this capacity for clear seeing. The ones who suffer most are not the ones who see the most. They're the ones who haven't learned to protect themselves while seeing. They're the ones who absorb everything without filtration, who take on every burden they perceive, who exhaust themselves trying to wake up a world that isn't ready to wake up. The ones who thrive, who manage to use their perception without being destroyed by it, they've learned something crucial. They've learned to be in the world but not of it. They can see clearly without being consumed by what they see. They can perceive deeply without losing themselves in others' experiences. They maintain what you might call a conscious distance, not the distance of cold withdrawal, but the distance of healthy boundaries. And how does one learn this? Well, it starts with spending time alone. Real time, not just physical solitude, but psychological solitude. Time where you're not taking in anyone else's emotions or thoughts or problems. Time where you can settle, like that muddy water we talked about, until you can see clearly which feelings are actually yours and which ones you've been carrying for others. It continues with learning to trust your perception without being controlled by it. Yes, you see that your friend's marriage is in trouble. Yes, you sense that your colleague is deeply unhappy. Yes, you feel the dysfunction in your family system. All of this may be absolutely true, but the question is not whether you see it correctly. The question is what you're going to do with this information. And sometimes, often actually, the wisest thing to do is nothing at all except hold the space for truth to eventually emerge on its own. This doesn't make you passive or uncaring. It makes you wise, because you understand that people change when they're ready to change, not when you need them to change. Problems get solved when the conditions are right, not when you've decided it's time for them to be solved. And consciousness develops at its own pace, which is almost never as fast as you'd like. So here we are at the heart of it. The danger of seeing what others don't is real. It can isolate you, exhaust you, turn you into a target for others' defensive anger, and cause you to lose contact with your own center. But it doesn't have to. Not if you learn to carry your awareness consciously. Not if you develop the strength to see without the compulsion to fix. Not if you can remain true to your perception while allowing others to remain true to their own process of waking up. The gift and the curse are the same thing. The question is only whether you'll learn to handle the gift with enough wisdom that it doesn't become a curse. Whether you'll develop the patience and the boundaries and the self-knowledge necessary to be clear without being crushed by your own clarity. And perhaps most importantly, whether you'll find others who can see as you see. Because they exist, you know. Other people who live in this odd space of perceiving more than most, of sensing what's hidden, of knowing what's unspoken. When you find these people, when you can finally be fully seen by someone who doesn't need you to be less perceptive, to feel comfortable, that's when the danger begins to transform into something beautiful. Because you realize you're not alone, after all. You're not crazy. You're not broken. You're simply awake in a world that mostly sleeps. And there are others who are awake too, and together, without force or pressure or urgency, you can hold space for consciousness to gradually spread, like dawn breaking slowly over a sleeping city. This is the hope within the danger, that your clear seeing, when held wisely, becomes not a burden you carry alone, but a light you offer to others, gently, patiently, allowing them to approach it when they're ready. If they're ever ready. And if they never are, well, that's their right. Your job isn't to wake them up. Your job is simply to remain awake yourself, to keep seeing clearly while learning to live peacefully with what you see. The danger is real, but so is the possibility. The possibility that you learn to be conscious without being consumed, that you'll see deeply without drowning in what you perceived, that you'll carry your awareness as a gift rather than a curse. And that, my friends, that is the art of living with eyes wide open in a world that prefers to keep them closed.